nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Ciccadillo.
This week, Biden's big deal. We'll take a look at the massive relief bill with Obama's former economics chief, Austan Goolsbee.
Voting rights have been stripped away in several key states, and also Biden's got himself a border crisis to deal with. But first,
Joe Biden has scored his first major legislative win of his presidency with the passage of the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan.
This is the most consequential legislation that many of us will ever be a party to.
The president signed it into law 24 hours earlier than planned, then called his first primetime Oval Office address to announce some ambitious targets. Everyone in America to be eligible for vaccinations by May 1st and a celebration on Independence Day in July.
We know what we need to do to beat this virus. Tell the truth. Follow the scientists and the science. Work together. Put trust and faith in our government to fulfill its most important function, which is protecting the American people. No function more important.
The final House vote this week was pro forma. Unlike the shenanigans in the Senate last weekend, a vote-a-rama marathon, 27 hours of debate, motions and amendments. Finally, the bill passed by the barest of margins.
The yeas are 50, the nays are 49. The bill as amended is passed.
Only Democrats cheering there, though. It was a straight party-line Senate vote with one Republican absent. Getting to yay, though, involved a bunch of haggling with moderate Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who bargained the proposed $400 a week unemployment payment back down to its current level of $300 a week for the next 6 months.
I'm just trying to bring balance, just some balance. The responsible middle, we're still there.
We've known for a couple of weeks that the minimum wage hike to $15 an hour had been ruled out of bounds for a reconciliation bill by the Senate parliamentarian. But Independent Senator Bernie Sanders wasn't taking that lying down.
Frankly, it is disgraceful that Congress has not passed an increase in the minimum wage since 2007.
Senator Sanders forced a vote, but it failed, and that saved Manchin and fellow moderate Democrat Kirsten Sinema of Arizona from having to strip it or oppose the entire bill, Chaz.
in the end, there are actually 8 Democrats voting against the minimum wage amendment. These 8 here. So there was a bit of safety in numbers there, although Kirsten Sinema strangely decided to stand out anyway, choosing to reject the amendment in a manner that Sanders supporters found particularly insulting, and that was an interesting choice from her. By the way, just to remind people, this is why Sanders is pushing so hard. This is the minimum wage adjusted for inflation, and it's now amongst the lowest levels it's been at for 70 years. Apparently, John, is going to deflate further yet.
Well, Democrat Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, despite all of that, was pretty well pleased.
We tell the American people, help is on the way.
Not everyone's convinced, though. Senator Mitt Romney, who was a part of that group of 10 Republicans who proposed a smaller $600 billion bill at a meeting with President Biden at the White House last month, bemoaned the Democrats' go-it-alone approach.
I actually believe that we make better legislation if we have 2 parties work together on something. In this case, we've crafted a piece of legislation that our party hasn't had any involvement in whatsoever. We tried. We went to the White House, and the president was very gracious in welcoming us and listening to us, but did not accept any of our proposals.
And of course, by going it alone, Democrats got a bill 3 times as big as the ones that the Republicans were going to support. But unlike last year's CARES Act and the COVID stimulus bills, Republicans are now arguing this bill is full of unnecessary payments to states whose revenues have actually increased during the pandemic. They claim it amounts to a long-term progressive wish list rather than targeted COVID recovery. And Chaz, it is certainly a bit of a turducken, it's fair to say. It is stuffed with some pretty major, potentially longer-term social reforms as well. There is a child allowance in the form of a tax credit, which is a pretty big deal. That is estimated to have the potential to lift more than 7 million Americans out of poverty.
Yeah, there's plenty of stuff in there. In fact, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget reckons that only about 5% of the bill is truly focused on public health needs surrounding the pandemic. So what's actually in there? Well, as you said, John, we got the $1,400 checks, we got the $350 billion worth of support for state and local governments, so they'll hopefully reverse their public job cuts. There's a lot of them. You mentioned also, John, the unemployment insurance extensions and the child tax credits. There's also $178 billion to get schools and colleges back open, and also to replace some of the 1.3 million jobs lost in education and healthcare last year. And then there's something else that doesn't get talked about much, a big slab for healthcare generally. This actually is a pretty big deal. They're increasing the Obamacare subsidies right across the board, so no one, whatever their income is, has to pay more than 8.5% of their income for health insurance. Because surprisingly, there are about 2.6 million people who currently make too much money to qualify for subsidies, but they're currently uninsured. So the Dems reckon that this bill could increase health insurance coverage by 4 to 5 million people. And when you add it all up, you can see the benefits are being spread across the income quintiles relatively evenly, which is a lot more than you could say for Trump's 2017 tax cuts, which were worth exactly the same amount, by the way, $1.9 trillion. About 65% of their benefits went to the top quintile. So a lot of love being spread around, John.
Yep, the quintiles have had a good week, Chaz. It is historically unusual, though, for one party to go it alone in this way. If you take a look at federal stimulus packages since the 2008 recession, the one leading into the global financial crisis, and this is the only one done without any bipartisan buy-in, and there is a clear pattern there as well. You might notice Democrats seemingly always happy to support government spending, even if it's being done under a Republican president. Republicans also happy to spend, but only if they're the ones calling the shots. Democratic President Barack Obama won just 3 Republican votes to overcome a filibuster in 2009. Biden circumvented that filibuster using the budget reconciliation process. Therefore, he did not need any Republican votes, and as a result, he's got Democrat written all over it.
Yeah, he didn't need the votes, but a partisan bill does lead to a partisan response. Like Tom Cotton, for instance, who made a big deal out of the Boston bomber who murdered 3 people and terrorised Boston, getting a stimulus check. Look, that is true. He probably did get a stimulus check.
He's not going to spend it on bombs again, though, is he?
No, he's not. And then also, the stimulus bill that Cotton supported in March and the stimulus bill that Cotton supported in December also did nothing to prevent prisoners from getting payouts. So it's all a bit cheap. The real question, though, is can this bill fill this gap here? The rather large jobs gap that has been going nowhere for the last 6 months. Pretty soon, all those lost jobs during the pandemic are going to become permanent. Having said that, there are some surprisingly green shoots sprouting about the economy. Real disposable personal income, for instance, actually rose during the pandemic. Then it fell, and then it rose again after the December stimulus. Put that together with the jumps in personal savings after the 2 stimuluses, and there is a lot of money just waiting to be spent when America moves on from the pandemic, which they expect to soon. This 3rd stimulus is going to add a lot more spending money to that pile over the next few months. So things could take off in a big way. Bloomberg surveyed forecasters are predicting growth of about 5.5% this year, whereas Goldman Sachs is predicting 7.7% growth. Sounds pretty wild, John. I think Biden, at the very least, is going to be counting on some kind of boost moving into the midterm cycle.
Yeah, he'll be hoping for that. So what will be both the immediate and the longer-term impact of the American Rescue Act? Austan Goolsbee was one of President Obama's top economic advisors when he inherited an American economy in freefall during the global financial crisis in early 2009. And Goolsbee later became the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He's now Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago and joins us from there now. Austan Goolsbee, welcome back to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
So put this into context for us. How big a deal is this relief plan?
It's a huge amount of money. It's a very big deal. The only thing that makes it not jaw-droppingly unprecedented is that at the beginning of the COVID crisis about a year ago, Congress passed something that was even bigger. But except for that, the so-called CARES Act, This is about the biggest thing that the Congress has ever passed.
Now, Austan, this latest bill is almost twice the value of the entire 2009 stimulus. But the economy at the moment is in a significantly better position than the economy was in 2009. So is it possible that there's too much stimulus?
Yes and no. The only thing that I will say is that I don't really consider this to be stimulus. It's a disaster relief bill, in my view. And because of that, the wrong way to think about it is to compare it to a regular business cycle and evaluate it like it was regular stimulus. A lot of this money doesn't, in the language of the economists, have a very big multiplier. Its goal is not to try to jumpstart the economy. It's really just trying to tide people over like a life preserver or something until this thing passes over us. So there is a danger that you could do too much. That danger would be that it would ignite inflation. Thus far, the market and the chairman of our central bank, as well as a lot of economists, if you just go look at the magnitude, there are big parts of the economy that are still in pretty tough shape, where the unemployment rate is still quite high for lower income workers and the kinds of people whose jobs cannot be done from home on a computer. So it's far better to err on the side of doing too much and doing it too soon and then using the tools we have to negate that than it is to sit on the sidelines while the unemployment rate is high and then say, oh, whoops, we should have done more.
You talked about this in terms of it being a life preserver, but some have argued, in fact, they're redesigning the boat right here, and that things like the child allowance could redesign the social safety net fundamentally in the United States when it comes to things like poverty. So just how far-reaching and long-lasting could this become?
I think that partly that's still to be determined. Is this going to jump the gap from short-run relief measure to parts of it being extended as more a permanent policy? I do think there are some interesting ideas in there. In the U.S., they have an earned income tax credit to try to encourage low-income workers. It's a sort of a backdoor way to raise the minimum wage without any danger of an employment effect. This expands that earned income tax credit quite significantly. As you mentioned, the money for people with children going through the tax code, both of those are, if not a brand new approach, certainly a big expansion of a form we haven't seen before. And I think the jury's still out a little bit. We're going to have to see, does that make the jump to permanent status?
Is it a concern just how much money in this bill is going towards people who don't actually need the money? I mean, you look at the employment situation for people who earn more than $60,000 a year, it's better than it was before the pandemic.
We've got one part of the economy where they never even had a recession. They're looking around and saying, the economy looks great. You know, already house prices of those mega $1 million mansions are up quite a lot. But we're having record use of food pantries. We've had an unprecedented increase in homelessness, and toward the bottom of the distribution, it's been a pretty rough go. And if you look at people with high school and less education, the unemployment rate is in the high double digits. So I think you got to have some targeting. You want to have some targeting. There is a lot in this bill. Yes, there are general checks. That's about 25% of the money. Most of the money is more targeted toward lower income people. And we saw with the first round of this a year ago that there are still a lot of people who need the money who either don't know they qualify, don't apply for it, don't get it. So you want to have a bit of redundancy and an insurance policy against a resurgence of the virus. I mean, if we get one of these new variants that is impervious to the vaccine or requires everyone in the United States, another 300 million people to go back out and get vaccinated again, that'll send us into another recession. And it will be too late by the time you see that to do something about it without a long lag. That's what happened to us last summer going into December.
And what would you say were the big lessons that the Biden administration learned from your experience back in 2009? Because it certainly seems that the new president has acted with lightning speed. He's gone really, really big, and he's immediately hitting the road to sell it and make sure he claims the credit for it too.
I think one of the lessons from 2009 that don't do part of it first and count on being able to come back and do more. They weren't able to do that in 2009, even though they needed to do more. And Vice President Biden became President Biden. He's not going to repeat that mistake. This is a big number up front. Do it fast because you may never get another chance to do it. I think the second lesson that the president has taken came from 2009, which is when you're in a crisis of this form that's about contagion and people passing fear on from one to the next. At that time, it was about banks failing, passing one to the next. Now it's about getting this disease. The making people not afraid isn't exactly in the choice set of the policymakers. You can change the conditions, but you've got to go out and sell it as you described. You got to describe again and again, here is what we're doing. Here is where it's working. Here is why I'm encouraging you to feel that your safety is improving. If you can improve the safety, you can get the economy to come back on a pretty rapid basis. And that's kind of what the private market is saying in the United States, that if they get the vaccines and they get this bill through, that GDP growth could be as high as 5 or even 6% for the year.
The original House bill, of course, contained that minimum $15 an hour federal minimum wage. That was one of the casualties of the process through the Senate. Is that now dead and buried, or could that come back in some other form?
Revisited, yes. The prospects that it passes, I think, are pretty difficult. The legislative process basically says only something that has to do with the budget can have a 50-vote requirement. If it doesn't have to do with the budget, then you have to get 60 votes to overcome the legislative maneuver. And so that's where you need 10 Republicans out of the 50 Republicans. I think they will certainly revisit the minimum wage, but I think it's also really hard to conceive that you could get 10 of the 50 Republicans to vote for a $15 minimum wage. That doesn't seem planetary.
Austan Goolsbee, thanks for your time.
See you guys later.
President Biden upped the order for the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine by another 100 million doses this week. It's not expected to bring forward the time when all Americans are vaccinated, but it now means they will have more than enough shots to do the job. President Biden again trumpeted the speed of the vaccine rollout during the first 50 days of his administration.
7 weeks ago, only 8% of the seniors, those most vulnerable to COVID-19, received the vaccination. Today, 60% of the people over the age of 65 or older have received at least one shot.
They are really getting a wriggle on now. When we last compared America to the rest of the world, all these countries were inoculating at a faster rate per capita than the US. But now, America is outpacing a number of them, like, for instance, the UK. So America is dosing up at a rate that is third in the world. And it's not just a lot of vaccines, but it's good vaccines as well. Pfizer has just shown in the lab that their vaccine will theoretically work against the variant that everyone is afraid of, the Brazilian variant. Right now, Brazil is #1 for COVID deaths by a mile. So fingers crossed there.
Yeah, let's hope it's more than just a theory. But of course, a year after the WHO declared a pandemic, for many Americans, this vaccine is coming too late. The US death toll is approaching 530,000 this week, and new figures from the Centre for Disease Control show a staggering 15% increase in the number of Americans who died last year. More Americans died last year than any previous year. COVID has become the third highest cause of death, behind just heart disease and all forms of cancer combined. In fact, COVID is within about 100,000 of overtaking cancer as cause of death.
That is incredible, John, but a slightly less incredible stat from the CDC. About 73% of American COVID deaths have been overweight people and 46% have been obese people. Now, some have interpreted that to mean you don't need to worry about COVID if you're thin. But hang on, 70% of America is overweight and 42% of America is obese. So really, the deaths are fairly proportionate. There is no golden ticket except for a vaccine.
Yeah, and as more states move to abandon mask mandates and social distancing this week, in the city of Boise, Idaho, they've been holding a mask-burning rally, including a mask with "Biden sucks" written on it.
That's not very bright, is it?
No, well, not unless they're used masks, in which case it is quite a sanitary way of disposing of them.
Maybe, okay. Look, masks are of course what helps states reopen Idaho. Remember that. By the way, the reason why many states are keeping their masks, apart from that, is because the UK variant is on the march. It's between 20 and 30% of the virus has been detected in a number of states now, and it was just 1 to 2% 4 weeks ago. Many expect it to double again within 10 days before the vaccines get there. And the last time that the UK variant turned up in 50% of virus checks, it was back in Europe, and it led to a major surge. So maybe don't burn that mask quite yet. Also, an update on returning to in-class learning in schools. We've talked about that a lot. The research is increasingly suggesting it should be happening pretty soon. Brown University's tracking survey of positive COVID tests found in early February that school staff were actually contracting COVID 30% less than the general community was, i.e., they were safer in the school than outside. And that trend continued in late February. Furthermore, when the CDC cited some studies to justify their caution about returning to school, the actual scientist who conducted one of those studies got narky, writing, "The CDC guidance does not take into account the data we have regarding disease transmission in schools." And they went further, saying keeping schools even partially closed is unwarranted, is harming children, and has become a human rights issue. Things are ramping up there, John.
They certainly are. Now, this week marked the 56th anniversary of the infamous Bloody Sunday attack on voting rights activists in Selma, Alabama. And it came at a time when some states are again trying to wind voting rights back. The fight for voting rights has been a long and painful one in the United States. In 1865, following a 4-year civil war, more than 250 years of African slavery ended in America with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. 3 years after that, the 14th Amendment granted former slaves citizenship rights and equal protection. But it wasn't until 1870 that the 15th Amendment ensured
the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
And it was still totally cool to deny people the right to vote on the basis of gender, and would be for another 50 years, by the way. But after 1890, former slave states in the South got to work trying to re-segregate their societies under so-called Jim Crow laws, named for a stereotypical black minstrel character, with legislation like the Louisiana Railway Separate Car Act.
Any passenger insisting on going into a coach or compartment to which, by race, he does not belong shall be liable to a fine of $25.
States of the old Confederacy also restricted ballot access for black male voters. They couldn't do it on racial grounds anymore, so they did it on the basis of wealth through poll taxes. If you couldn't pay the tax, you couldn't register to vote. Literacy tests were also used to deny the vote to poorly educated former slaves. And if taxes and tests weren't enough, some white election officials would just refuse to let a black man cast a ballot. The Democratic Party declared their primaries were whites only. And then there was widespread election violence and intimidation, including hundreds of lynchings by the likes of the Ku Klux Klan. And it worked. In the state of Louisiana in 1896, there were 130,000 registered black voters. 8 years later, at the election of 1904, that was reduced to just 1,342. Jim Crow laws and the segregationist myth of separate but equal access endured in much of the South for the next 60 years or so. Grandfather laws prevented anyone from registering to vote whose grandfather hadn't been enrolled, again, mostly affecting the descendants of slaves. When courts ruled that unconstitutional, black voters in Oklahoma were given just 11 days to enrol or be banned from voting for life. And it wasn't until the 1960s that things really began to change.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago.
Along with the Civil Rights Act, 1964 also saw the 24th Amendment finally ban poll taxes. 4 months later, there was record black turnout for the presidential election. 58% of almost 21 million eligible black voters, twice the level of any previous election. But there was still a massive regional divide. Outside the South, there was 72% black turnout. In the South itself, just 44% of black voters cast a ballot. And here is part of the reason why. Confusing literacy tests like this one, also from the state of Louisiana. In theory, it could be given to anyone who couldn't prove they'd completed the 5th grade, but in practice, it was mostly given to black people.
In the first circle below, write the last letter of the first word beginning with L. Draw a line from circle 2 to circle 5 that will pass below circle 2 and above circle 4. What?
And get just one answer wrong, you couldn't vote. In other cases, black voters were told to recite the US Constitution from memory, 4,500 words of it. The brutal attack by Alabama state troopers and a white mob on John Lewis and his fellow voting rights campaigners in Selma on March 7, 1965, was seen on television screens across America and around the world. President Lyndon Johnson vowed to act.
It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned literacy tests and grandfather laws and provided federal oversight of voter registration in areas where fewer than 50% of the non-white population were registered to vote. And 9 states had to get federal approval to change their voting laws. And that held until 2013.
After nearly half a century, the U.S. Supreme Court pulled the plug today on federal supervision of 9 mostly southern states whose records on race relations were deemed a threat to minority voting rights.
At the time, Chief Justice John Roberts justified the decision saying America had changed. But Eric Holder, the first black Attorney General serving in the administration of America's first black president, Barack Obama, said it hadn't changed enough to gut the Voting Rights Act.
These problems have not been consigned to history. They continue to exist. Their effects are real. They are of today, not yesterday, and they corrode the foundations of our democracy.
Since 2013, dozens of states have moved to again limit ballot access, including the shutting down of polling places, expanding ID requirements, and purging voter registration rolls. During the coronavirus pandemic, the 2020 election saw a surge in early and mail-in voting, with over 66% of eligible American voters casting a ballot. That was up more than 6 points on 2016 and higher than previous peaks of 2008, 1960 and 1908. In fact, it was the best turnout for any year since 1900, when those Jim Crow laws were taking hold. The battle is now on to see if those COVID voting measures are made permanent under the new For the People Act or rolled back following false claims of voter fraud from defeated Republican President Donald Trump. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act aims to restore elements of the 1965 law stripped away by the Supreme Court in 2013. But both bills seem destined to fail in the US Senate unless another relic of the Jim Crow era, the filibuster, is finally overturned.
Please get together, break up this old Jim Crow.
This week, the Republican governor of Iowa, Kim Reynolds, signed into law new restrictions on early voting. Literally dozens of bills claiming to restore election integrity are working their way through the Georgia state legislature. By one count, 253 proposed laws limiting voter access have now been introduced by Republicans in 43 states.
And like you're implying there, John, their connection to election integrity is not always clear. In Iowa, for instance, they're closing the polls an hour earlier and cutting the number of days when people can vote early from 29 to 20. How that safeguards elections, I'm not sure. Meanwhile, in Georgia, they've been trying to heavily reduce Sunday voting, which is hugely popular amongst black voters, coincidentally. And they've been trying to limit volunteers from providing water, snacks and chairs to voters who have been waiting in line all day. Although those ideas may well have ended up in the round file, thankfully. Also interesting is that the states passing the most electoral integrity laws just happen to be the key swing states: Arizona, Pennsylvania and Georgia. Funny that, but seriously, there is a question mark over these tactics. Stanford's boffins compared turnout rates amongst Texas 65-year-olds who are allowed to vote absentee with turnout amongst Texas 64-year-olds who are generally not allowed to vote absentee. And they found their turnout rates were almost exactly the same, even though 18% of 65-year-olds voted absentee and only 3% of 64-year-olds voted absentee. Also, the proportion of 65-year-olds voting Democrat was only 0.2% higher. So basically no difference. Similarly, the 7 states that saw the biggest increase in absentee votes in 2020 actually trended very slightly towards Trump, not away from him. So these kinds of laws might not only be anti-democratic, but also kind of pointless.
Yeah, maybe. Well, for more, we're joined by Sylvia Albert, Director of Voting and Elections at Common Cause, a non-partisan voting rights watchdog organisation. Sylvia Albert, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
I'm wondering, are you surprised at the speed with which we have seen Republicans in the last couple of weeks in the majority of American states looking at moving legislation to wind back a lot of voter access and voter rights laws?
I'm really not surprised, unfortunately. In the last few years, it has generally become the Republican mantra that voter access is bad. So it was expected, and it's just really blatant and unfortunate.
There seems to be this ongoing assumption, at least amongst some political types, that high voter turnout elections favour Democrats and low voter turnout elections favour Republicans. But political scientists keep on saying, no, that is not the case. And Donald Trump obviously did pretty well with as far as turnout goes as well. What do you think? Do you think that high turnout necessarily correlates with an advantage of Democrats?
No, it absolutely doesn't. I think you can point to this past election where we had exceptional turnout, and except for Donald Trump, who is a polarizing figure in and of himself, the Republican Party did really well across the board. They held on to state legislatures, they gained ground in the House. Their turnout was just as high as Democrat turnout. But there is a perception that voters who have a harder time turning out, voters of color, voters who are low income, will vote Democrat. So if you make voting easier, more people will come out and they'll vote Democrat. But as you said, the political scientists say it isn't so, but it's so part of the kind of political assumptions that they have not recalibrated.
How does that follow, Sylvia, given that we know statistically African Americans, about 85% support Democrats, Latinos, Asian Americans, again, majority support for Democrats, and many of those are in those groups that do struggle to find the time to vote on a Tuesday in November?
Well, I think what you've seen in this past election is that high turnout really doesn't limit itself to people who have easy access. What high turnout does is also inspire people who have difficult access to go above and beyond. So just because more people turn out doesn't mean that they are inherently going to vote one way or another.
Along the same line, Sylvia, it's been at least 30 years, maybe 40 years, that Republicans have been passing these laws that could be seen as highly suppressive. Yet voter turnout has not gone down, it's held steady, and black turnout has gone up. Why doesn't it seem to register with people that this is a waste of time?
Well, because in reality, it's not a waste of time. When elections are close, they can turn on a very small percentage of people. So when we look at Wisconsin in the 2016 election, Donald Trump won Wisconsin by 20,000 votes. Over 200,000 people were unable to vote because of voter ID laws. You're just kind of eroding along the edges. Just getting those little bits of people around the edges can have a real difference.
Are there some measures that you think it is fair enough for Republicans to be saying, you know what, that really was just about last year. We shouldn't be doing those things. We shouldn't have that much mail-in voting. We shouldn't have that much early voting access. Are there things that you would concede, yeah, fair enough, that was really just about a pandemic?
Actually, no. I think that we need a voter-centric system that provides access in a variety of ways to meet the voters where they are. Right now, I live in Washington, D.C., so I can early vote, I can vote by mail, I can register on Election Day. No problem. If you live in Texas, you need an excuse to vote by mail. Early voting is very limited. You can't register to vote on Election Day. And why do I have those rights when people in Texas don't?
Sylvia, would you prefer to see a situation where it's as easy as possible to vote over an extended period of time, with lots of early voting, lots of mail-in voting, lots of options, or would you prefer a completely different way of holding an election, which is to have a public holiday and just make it incredibly easy for everyone to vote on Election Day?
Well, while I'm in favor of a public holiday, it can't be the only answer. What we see on public holidays is a change in public transportation, right? I don't know how it is in Australia, but all of our public transportation run Sunday light schedules. So that is going to make it harder for people to go to vote. On public holidays, government buildings are closed. So those are polling places that can no longer be used. And the reality is that everything isn't closed on public holidays. If you want to go to the grocery store, it's open. If you want to go to a restaurant, it's open. Here, President's Day seems to be the day everybody buys mattresses. So mattress stores are open. So you're still not reaching those hourly workers. They don't get the day off.
Sylvia, what's your expectation with all these state laws? Are they going to be tied up in the courts? Is this going to be a Supreme Court issue? Or is there the prospect of federal legislation to override it? How do you think this ultimately plays out?
Well, we definitely feel that H.R. 1 is a strong bill, a strong democracy builder that would, have an effect on these bills in the states. It is not going to be easy to get H.R. 1 passed. That's not a 2-week thing. It's a long haul to try to do so. But in reality, the politics in the states means that very few states are actually going to be able to enact these laws, because there are governors who will veto them. And of course, there will be litigation. I'm expecting litigation regardless, but it's really only a few states that are actually going to be able to enact these things. And I think you're hearing about them now. Georgia and Arizona are kind of in the news. And that's because Republicans have control of both the state house and the governorship.
Sylvia Albert, good to talk to you today. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And we do have a bonus interview for you this week. We also spoke to voting rights campaigner Martin Luther King III, the eldest son of Dr. King. And I asked him what his late father would have made of this current battle.
My father would be greatly disappointed in our nation's leadership in the direction that they've chosen to take. But he would also never give up and know that we can and we must and we will do better. And he would be leading that campaign or that crusade, I believe.
And you can find the full interview with Martin Luther King III on YouTube, Facebook and ABC iView now. The looming crisis on America's southern border is now a full-blown crisis, as far as Fox News is concerned.
Now, despite mounting evidence of a real migrant surge and a real crisis at the border, strained resources, all the chaos we're witnessing, the Biden administration still steadfastly is refusing to acknowledge what is, in fact, reality, a full-blown crisis.
And Sean is right, at least to the extent that there has been a big surge in undocumented arrivals and asylum seekers at the southern border. Texas Republican Governor Greg Abbott blames Joe Biden, and he's talking Texas tough.
If you dare step into the state of Texas, Texas will use every tool and strategy we can to arrest anybody who's violating the law, to put behind the bars anybody who's violating the law.
And one of the concerns of authorities in Texas is that Mexican drug cartels are trafficking migrants to overwhelm border security so they can then more easily smuggle drugs into the United States. And Chaz, this is turning into a real headache for Joe Biden.
It really is, whether you call it a crisis or not. These are the encounter numbers on the southern border, with a big jump from 76,000 to 100,000 new migrants last month. And it's going to get much worse. This time back in 2019, there were 76,000 encounters, and then over springtime, everything went nuts. So that seems ominous, especially given they already don't seem to have the time to give the migrants they intercept COVID tests. The town of Brownsville has been testing the migrants who stopped there directly after being released by ICE, and they've found 108 COVID positive migrants already in a couple of months, and that's 6% of the people they tested. But they don't actually have the authority to detain those migrants. So the migrants just take their COVID and go, leading to these kinds of predictable reactions on Fox.
You listen to me. They've got COVID. They've got all kinds of diseases. They are being released into the United States.
And you know, I don't think people are going to be less upset about that situation over time. But even worse, on the occasions that children arrive with a grandparent, say, or a relative, they actually have to be separated from that relative by law until they know that that relative is for real. But the process of working it out can take weeks or even months. So you can see where this is going. It's not as dramatic as Trump-era family separations, which, if you recall, were performed intentionally as a deterrent, but they are still family separations, and they are still detrimental, especially given that when Trump was doing this, the absolute peak of the crisis saw about 2,600 children detained by the Border Patrol. They're the guys with the nasty prison-like facilities, which I'm sure you remember. But right now, there are so many kids crossing the border, there are a record-breaking 3,500 migrant children stuck in Border Patrol facilities. That's right, it is worse than under the peak of Trump. But wait, they have a legal obligation to move those kids after 72 hours in Border Patrol custody, for good reason. And on February 21st, only 9 kids were being held by the Border Patrol past the 3-day limit. A little over 2 weeks later, 1,400 unaccompanied children were being held in the nasty Border Patrol facilities past the legal 3-day limit. And it's likely to get much worse. I'm going to be talking a lot more about this next week, and none of it is good.
Time to have a chat, Chaz, and pressure continues to mount on New York Governor Andrew Cuomo to resign after a 6th woman came forward to allege inappropriate behaviour. This time, the kind of physical contact, basically groping, that he has directly denied, that matter has been referred to police, and New York State Democrats are now pushing ahead with at least what could be the start of an impeachment process. So whether he chooses to resign or not, or run again next year or not, it could even be taken out of his hands.
It could, and I'm not surprised because this allegation is extremely serious. Not that the other ones aren't serious, but as you say, this one's potentially criminal. Like, what is alleged is that a Cuomo staffer was called to his mansion to supposedly help Cuomo with his mobile phone, but when they were alone, he closed the door, reached under her blouse, and allegedly began to fondle her. Now, we are well into resigning territory of those kinds of stories. In fact, the latest YouGov poll has 48% of people saying Cuomo should resign to 18% saying he shouldn't resign. Even Democrats are saying 37% to 29% that Cuomo should resign. That brings us to the new Trump standard that you and Dr. Dave talked about on the Fireside last week, where you just brazen your way through scandal and it'll go away eventually. 538 crunched the numbers and they found that since 2017, 57 federal or state politicians have faced scandal. Only 12 of that 57 have resigned, although for those facing allegations of unwanted sexual advances, it's 7 out of 14 that resigned, so slightly higher numbers there. Still, Cuomo in particular strikes me as a real stubborn sort and a real entitled kind of guy, so I reckon he's going the distance. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of people that have worked with Andrew Cuomo over the years, back to when he was in the Clinton administration, say he is not the kind of guy who is going to resign, partly because that is essentially a confession. And it will tarnish his legacy, his 3-term legacy as Governor of New York. Whether he is now able to stand for a 4th term in November next year, highly, highly unlikely. So that could be how this plays out. He just serves out his term in a bit of disgrace. Interesting though, some Democrats, not necessarily leaping to his defence, but Gretchen Whitmer, Democrat of Michigan, governor there, saying, this certainly looks like a double standard is being applied. Maybe it's a positive double standard, but Donald Trump was accused of this stuff and much, much worse. And he served 4 years as President of the United States. He was impeached twice, but not for rape, which is what he was accused of. That was apparently fine. But now they're looking to get rid of Andrew Cuomo. But of course, Andrew Cuomo, it's not just about these 6 different allegations against him, but also the fact that he could be facing not just a criminal prosecution for sexual assault, he could be facing a criminal prosecution for misleading the Justice Department over the number of COVID deaths in New York nursing homes.
Yeah, that scandal is becoming worse by the day. It turns out that, like you mentioned, that they misled the Justice Department potentially, but on top of that, their excuse for misleading the Justice Department and New York and America is a lie. Their excuse was that they were doing it because Trump was breathing down their neck, he was politicising the deaths in the nursing homes, and they feared that they were going to be under investigation by the Department of Justice. That was in August, all that stuff was happening. It turns out that the order went out from Cuomo's top staffers, whether Cuomo had anything to do with it, he probably did, in June, 2 months before then. But you know what happened the week after the order went out? He started talking about his book. And you might go, well, hang on, that's a pretty lame motive that he wants to write a book about how awesome he is with COVID. There's a lot of talk about his advance. Could have been in the mid-millions, like $5 or $6 million. So that is incentive to keep your reputation going, apart from general political incentives to try and avoid concerns. So that's an issue, that there's lies going on there. On top of that, it's always very hard to know where this is, the ramifications of this decision. What would have happened in the alternative where that order didn't exist with the nursing homes? The Empire Centre has done a study where they've actually, because not every nursing home took part, and they've compared the cruncher numbers on the nursing homes that took part compared to the nursing homes that didn't take part. And they said there's a noticeable bump in the deaths of the nursing homes that took part. And they are estimating it's about 1,000 people who they estimate probably died because of that single decision from Andrew Cuomo. So that's quite a body count.
Which, if he was honest and upfront about it and said, look, if we knew back in April or March that we weren't going to have 40,000 people on ventilators, which is what we thought. We weren't going to have a full hospital ship in New York Harbour, which ended up sitting there empty for months. That it wasn't going to get nearly as bad, or that the disease was going to progress in a different way with different age groups and so on. Maybe that was a bad decision, but we made it with the best available information and with the best possible intention. But he didn't say that. He covered it up. It's the old story. It's the cover-up that gets you.
Yeah, and I should say, by the way, we've completely forgotten about one aspect of this, which is that the homes for disabled people had the same order and they never took it away. It's still in place even now, but people are ignoring them. But anyway, that's a whole different thing. Yeah. But talking about people who could be sent back to nursing homes, Joe Biden is getting the treatment again for his brain fades. As the viral clips are piling up, sometimes it's a bit hard to know if it's for real or not. He's been a bit vague in some of them.
The vast majority of economists, left, right, and center, from Wall Street to the private economic polling initiatives. The economists, as I said, left, right, and center, say, in addition to the needs the people have, we need this to grow the economy.
Yeah, look, we've all been there, me especially. Sometimes it's a bit ambiguous what's going on, like this one here.
Just want to thank you both, and I want to thank the former general. I keep calling him general, but the guy who runs that outfit over there. I want to make sure we thank the secretary.
So did Biden genuinely forget his Secretary of Defense's name and the name the Pentagon? Hard to know. Maybe he did forget. Maybe he was just being casual and Biden-y. I don't know. But sometimes the supposed exposés of Biden are just him being taken out of context. This one was funny.
Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions if that's what I'm supposed to do, Nance, whatever you want me to do.
But in reality, no one was trying to shut Biden up there. That was from a congressional retreat where he made a public speech and then took private questions. That's the standard protocol at those retreats. But this all does raise the question. If Biden isn't sundowning and he can take questions, why doesn't he? Biden still hasn't held a single official press conference as president. He did do a town hall on CNN, and he does take ad hoc questions every now and then, but still no formal presser. If you look at how long it took the last 100 years of presidents to hold their first press conferences, Biden is the slowest by a mile, and he's still going. So, John, is this a problem?
Well, it's fascinating to see because clearly the narrative that was being pushed last year, Joe Biden's being kept in hiding in his basement because he can't speak, he can't put a sentence together. To an extent that was dispelled through the debate performances and so on. But yeah, he does struggle at times. He's a 78-year-old and maybe he's having senior moments or maybe it just is a perception thing because you look at Fox News and literally every night Hannity and Tucker Carlson are running together montages of every pause, every every slightly confused look, mashing them all together in a way that is quite misleading. But there are some senior moments there as well. The guy's a senior. He's closer to 80 than he is to 75, you know. And one thing as well I think is worth noting in all of this, it's not just about Biden's age, but if we look at presidential press conferences back over that same 100 or so year period that you're talking about, Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal they called him, he wasn't nearly as silent as you might think. He gave almost 73 press conferences a year. Herbert Hoover gave 67, FDR 73, then a big drop-off. Truman, 42 a year. Eisenhower, 24 a year. JFK, 23, LBJ, 26. Nixon, just 7. Ford, 16 a year. Carter, 15 a year. Reagan, just 6 press conferences a year. One every 2 months, less than. Since then, the average has been sort of between about 34 and 20. The big change, though, of course, under Harry Truman, what happened then in the late 40s, early 50s in America? Television happened. The ability to carry presidential press conferences live on TV. It's all very well if you're Calvin Coolidge sitting with the gentlemen of the press over port and cigars, but if you're live on TV, anything can happen. And as we've seen with Joe Biden, anything can happen with Joe. He'll say something that doesn't quite make sense.
That is true. That is true. I suppose for me, it's just a case of let's leave aside the sundowning thing. You just need to be accountable. We've been talking about immigration, for instance. People are yelling questions at him every time he turns up about the immigration crisis. He's ignoring them all. And Jen Psaki's basically banging them down, saying, I'll circle back to that later on. Like, there's got to be some kind of accountability at some point in time.
Yeah. I guess Democrats have countered saying Jen Psaki is going out there every day, unlike the Trump press secretaries, and Trump is not going out there every day telling lies.
That's true.
There is that. But look, talking about meeting the press, I wanted to mention this week the death of American journalist Roger Mudd at the age of 93. He was one of the icons of American broadcast journalism. Roger Mudd produced a particularly important, in-depth 45-minute report on what was, at that time, the likely 1980 presidential campaign of Senator Ted Kennedy. And Mudd asked Kennedy about his family, about his failing marriage, his wife's alcoholism, Teddy's own culpability in the 1969 death of campaign worker Mary Jo Kopechne at Chappaquiddick, where Teddy left the scene of the accident inexplicably. But with all of that being covered, it was this one devastatingly simple question, rather than all the scandals, that did the most damage to Teddy Kennedy's election hopes. Take a look.
Why do you want to be president? Well,
And Teddy Kennedy's halting answer meandered for a couple of minutes. He talked about energy, he talked about inflation, he talked about America falling behind other nations, but it created the impression that Teddy Kennedy didn't really want to be president, or if he did want to be president, he didn't know why he wanted to be president other than through some birthright inherited through his two murdered brothers. That, why do you want to be president, is now known as the Mudd question, the Roger Mudd question. Every presidential candidate rehearses and rehearses their answer because that caused him a whole lot of damage, Chaz. But before we go this week, it is time to bust some malarkey.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
And not for the first time. The malarkey this week is about one of President Biden's dogs. We talked recently, Chaz, about claims that 13-year-old Champ Biden is suffering from neglect. Pictures circulating of him look like an old flea bag. Well, now it is 3-year-old Major Biden that's making major news.
Presidential pooch Major Biden has gone from the White House to the doghouse after he was involved in an incident at his new home on Monday. A Secret Service official tells NBC News the dog nipped an agent's hand but didn't break any skin.
And starting with CNN, multiple media outlets then reported that both Major and Champ Biden had been banished from the White House, sent home to Biden's place in Wilmington, Delaware, after aggressive behaviour at the White House involving Major. And that was true in a literal sense, Chaz. They were sent back after that incident, but not because of that incident. They weren't banished. The White House confirmed the pair were already due to go back to Delaware to stay with Biden family members because the President and First Lady are travelling over the next week or so. It wasn't because of the bite.
The dogs will return to the White House soon.
And dog experts, by the way, Chaz, say it is wrong to assume that Major is having these adjustment problems because he's a shelter dog. They say it's probable that he's just adjusting to unfamiliar surroundings, which would have to be pretty weird for a dog at the White House.
Major didn't do this because he's a shelter dog. He did this because he was a dog under an elevated level of stress.
He's a stressed dog. Now, while I would be tempted to suggest that all this coverage of the first dogs is ridiculous, I have to say, I think there's a genuine scandal here, John.
Really?
Yes, because when the appropriately named Daily Beast ran this scoop about the Biden dogs telling a pet psychic a lot, Major was taking a very different position. In fact, the very first thing the psychic got was that he was very excited about moving to the White House. She had a real connection and felt that excitement of his. So those are not the psychically divine words of a dog that goes and bites people, John.
Yes.
I think this lead requires further investigation, possibly by the dog whisperer.
Yes, we'll keep you right up to date on more Champ and Major news as it comes to hand. And that's it for another trip to Planet America. Full interviews plus a bonus chat with Martin Luther King III available for you online and on iView.
And I have a brand new piping hot pet podcast right there. Go have a listen. See you later.